All right, hey guys, we're going to be moving at a pretty quick pace here today. We're going to try to get the last three sections of the chapter finished today. We're going to be talking about voting rights, and we're going to talk about some changes and challenges in the movement that kind of caused it to split. So first, let's get right into voting rights. 1960s, after the successes of battling segregation, Black Americans began to turn their attention toward voting rights. We're going to talk about the methods that they used to gain these rights. How political organizing became a national issue, and the events that led to the Voting Rights Act. And again, you'll have your videos that go along with these as well. All right, so voting rights for African Americans were achieved at a great sacrifice, and Kennedy, in his presence, he's really concerned about the violent reactions to the civil rights movement that we've seen so far in places like Birmingham. Robert Kennedy basically went to the leaders of SNCC and said, look, instead of doing these confrontational type things, how about focus on voter registration? And he says, the federal government will protect civil rights workers if they're focused on voter registration. The 24th Amendment passed during that time, which outlawed the poll tax, which negatively impacted poor people, specifically blacks in the South. And what happens is SNCC really rounds up hundreds of volunteers to spend their summers registering blacks in the South to vote. So SNCC and CORE come together and create what's called the Voter Education Project, or VEP. And basically, thousands of volunteers will flood into the South to try to register African Americans to vote. But opposition is very strong to this throughout the South. And in Mississippi specifically, it was especially hard because these workers feared for their safety. And a lot of times people weren't willing to go register because it might make them targets. But despite that, VEP was a success. And by 1964, they'd registered more than 500,000 African American voters in Mississippi. Of course, I already talked a little bit about the 24th Amendment, which was passed in August of 1962. And this amendment banned states from taxing citizens. And unfortunately, though, it only applied to federal elections, whether Congress, Senate, or presidential elections. So state elections were still not affected by this. So SNCC wants to go even further. So in 1965, they planned and executed Freedom Summer. And what they did is got hundreds of college volunteers to spend the summer basically working throughout Mississippi, specifically but also other southern states, but to register African Americans to vote. Most of these people were from poor southern African American families. However, a lot of the volunteers that were being trained were white, middle class Northerners. So basically they would register voters or go to a community and live in a community set up what's called freedom schools to basically teach people the basic skills they would need to know to be able to register. During this process, three civil rights workers, Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney. Goodman and Schwerner were both white men, and James Chaney was a black man, but they had gone to inspect a church that had been bombed, and basically the men disappeared. President Johnson, he had taken office by this time, orders a massive hunt, but their bodies were discovered in a earthen dam near Philadelphia, Mississippi. Basically, what had happened is the sheriff of the town had pulled them over and basically taken them into custody. And once he got them back to the jail, he turned them over to Klan members, who then tortured, beat, and murdered all three. 21 suspects were tried for the case, but most of them were just tried for the federal case of violating civil rights laws. They weren't tried in the state because murder is a state law. So the state of Mississippi did not try them for those murders. Freedom Project, the Project Freedom Summer, the Freedom Summer Project was basically pretty successful. I mean, again, they taught over 3,000 students at the Freedom Schools. More than 17,000 African Americans in Mississippi had applied to vote, which is the most up to that point. The previous 500,000 the previous summer had been done all throughout the South, and Mississippi had been a specifically difficult nut to crack. But of the 17,000 applications, only about 1,600 are accepted by Mississippi state elections officials. So this kind of shows the need for a federal law. So basically what's going to happen is this drive for political rights is going to become a national issue. And part of the reason why Johnson is elected by such a landslide in 64, this says 62, it should be 64, is because of the help of civil rights leaders like Dr. King. And they basically agreed to suspend protests until after Election Day. SNCC, however, being a more radical group, refuses. They say, look, we want to protest segregation within the Democratic Party, because it was Southern Democrats that were pushing a lot of these laws and a lot of this resistance against the civil rights movement. So SNCC forms the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And basically they elected 68 delegates to the Democratic National Convention and asked to be seated. And it causes a little bit of a controversy, because the Mississippi official Democratic Party delegation was all white, didn't allow blacks. Now, Fannie Lou Hamer is chosen to deliver the address to the convention on why the MFDP should be seated as the official delegation, and you've got that video. You need to watch it. It's really good, eloquent speech about all the troubles that she's faced and how she wants to be treated as an American citizen. So Johnson offers a compromise. He seats 2 members of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and the rest are guests of the convention. The more moderate NAACP and SCLC accept the compromise, but SNCC and the MFDP refuse. In the end, the challenge fails, and it does begin to show this fracture, this split between the more moderate and the more radical parts of the movement. All right. Again, we're going to watch you're going to watch the video on Fannie Lou Hamer on your own. But anyway, so you start to have this split, but the push for voting rights continues, and it really ebbs with the Selma campaign. And King and SCLC organized marches in Selma, Alabama, that resulted in mass arrests, mass jailings, and police began to attack these marches. So King and SCLC announced a 4-day march from Selma to the Alabama state capital in Montgomery. And 600 black Americans begin the 54-mile march. They camp out on the way. And as they reach Selma, city and state police, led by Jim Clark, blocked their way out of Selma or into Montgomery. And TV cameras capture the police using clubs and chains, cattle prods, tear gas, all sorts of things on the marchers. And this violence is broadcast across the country, and it leads to President Johnson going to Congress asking for tough voting laws. So they passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And this proved to be one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation. And it again shows this pattern of using direct confrontation, nonviolent direct pressure to cause violent confrontation and lead to federal action. And you have a video of the violence at Selma to watch on the website as well. So we talked about some of these early splits, and we'll see how the civil rights movement expands to the north, how it's different in the north and the south, and we're going to talk about the death of Dr. King and some other issues as well. So the civil rights movement expanded to the north because where in the south you had de jure segregation, segregation by law, and most of that was eradicated, you still had de facto segregation in many northern cities, which means it wasn't mandated by law, but it existed in fact. And you also had discrimination in housing, getting loans, getting jobs, and this was a major problem. So the movement expands. Most African Americans outside the South lived in cities, whereas many blacks in the South were still rural. And in many of these places, they're kept in all black parts of town. You had discrimination in banking and home ownership that made it difficult to move up to improve their station, and job discrimination resulted in high unemployment in the black community. So frustration over this explodes into violence in the late 60s. You had Watts in Los Angeles in 1965, Detroit in 1967, and President Johnson is forced to appoint the Kerner Commission to study the causes of urban rioting. And poverty and discrimination are really shown as the root of this movement. These riots convinced King that the civil rights movement needed to move north, and he starts the Poor People's Campaign in Chicago in 1966. Unfortunately, it winds up being a failure because most African Americans didn't share the civil rights focus. They were more concerned about economic concerns in the North. And also some northern whites that had supported the movement in the South didn't like it being on their turf, and he kind of lost some of his white support as well. You also have conflict amongst the different groups. SNCC and CORE is becoming more radical, and in 1966, SNCC is going to abandon the philosophy of nonviolence. Stokely Carmichael, the leader of SNCC at the time, famously says, "I've been arrested 20 some odd times and I ain't going to jail no more." Then you had the formation of a new Black Panther Party by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. And of course, in the early 60s, Malcolm X and the black Muslims had been criticizing King for quite some time. So the rise of black power is a new development in the movement. And Stokely Carmichael, who's the head of SNCC in 1966, basically says that we need to stop depending on the largesse of the white man and proclaim our own power. So you have the cry of black power beginning during this time. The Black Panther Party, which was formed in Oakland, it takes this a step further, and they actually call for the need for violent revolution to claim black rights. And Black Panther Party members will police their own neighborhoods. They basically don't leave it up to white police officers to police crime and things of that nature. So they're almost like a community empowerment group. And then, of course, the black Muslims of Malcolm X in the early 60s, before he breaks with them, basically has this message of black nationalism, self-reliance, separatism, and Malcolm X has a message of hope and defiance and black pride that that many blacks perceive as different from what King is preaching. And of course, you have videos of Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X to be watching. All right, the King has become aware that economic issues had to be part of the civil rights movement. So, after the failure of the Poor People's Campaign in Chicago, he goes to Memphis, Tennessee to help striking workers, sanitation workers there, garbage men basically. And while he's down there, he's shot on his hotel balcony by James Earl Ray. Basically, this is a national tragedy. Within hours of King's assassination, riots erupt in more than 120 cities throughout the United States. Within weeks, almost 50 people are dead, almost 3,000 were injured, and more than 21,000 were arrested. And there is billions of dollars worth of property damage, some of which American inner cities have still never really recovered from. And of course, you have a video of King's last speech on your website as well, his famous "I've been to the mountaintop" speech. We're going to end there. We'll pick up the last section in the next video. It'll be a short one, so we'll talk to you then. See ya.